On the morning we were supposed to sign the final papers, I remember how heavy the air felt when I stepped out of my car. The courthouse parking lot was quiet except for the soft hum of traffic in the distance. I held the folder pressed against my chest, as if it could steady my nerves. My hands felt cold even though the sun was warm on my face. I kept telling myself this was finally the end of everything. Inside the lobby, the scent of old paper and polished floors made me think of every appointment that had led us here. I walked slowly, noticing the soft squeak of my shoes echoing against the walls. My chest tightened with each step, as if the building itself could sense my hesitation. I wasn't scared of the paperwork. I was scared of the silence between my sister and me. It felt like a thin thread ready to snap the moment either of us spoke. I arrived early on purpose, needing a few minutes to settle my breathing before she walked in. The bench outside the conference room felt harder than I expected, and I shifted my weight, trying to release the tension in my shoulders. I stared at the frosted glass door, watching vague shapes pass by on the other side. My heart beat steadily but too fast, like it was trying to outrun whatever was coming. I kept rubbing my thumb across the edge of my folder, grounding myself. The conference room was still empty when the attorney finally opened the door for me. His voice was calm, but I noticed the slight flicker of his eyes, as if he was trying to measure my mood. I sat down slowly, feeling the coolness of the chair through my jacket. The table smelled faintly of disinfectant, sharp and sterile. I placed my folder in front of me, aligning it neatly just to keep my hands busy. My breathing steadied, but only because I forced it to. I kept glancing toward the doorway, waiting for her to appear. Every shadow in the hallway made my stomach clench, but none of them were hers. I tried stretching my fingers, letting them uncurl slowly, noticing the slight tremble I couldn't seem to hide. The attorney shuffled papers softly, giving me space without saying anything. The quiet in the room felt too delicate, like the slightest sound could shatter it. I wished I didn't care so much about how today would unfold. When she finally walked in, the air shifted in a way that made the hairs rise on my arms. She moved slowly, almost rehearsed, with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile, each step too controlled. I sat up straighter without meaning to, as if bracing myself. She didn't look at me right away, only at the stack of documents waiting on the table. Something in her posture felt practiced, and it unsettled me more than I expected. I offered a quiet greeting, but my voice sounded thinner than I intended. She replied with a soft nod, barely glancing at me before pulling out her chair. I noticed the way she smoothed her skirt, slow and deliberate, as if she wanted to appear composed. The attorney began reviewing the agenda, but his words felt distant. My attention stayed on the way my sister kept her hands folded too tightly on the table, knuckles pale. Something in her tension mirrored mine, but for different reasons. The papers sat in front of us, like a quiet reminder of everything we had lost along the way. I traced the edge of one page with my eyes, noticing a small wrinkle near the corner, where it had been handled before. My throat felt dry, and I took a slow breath, trying to settle the unease curling in my stomach. She shifted in her chair, adjusting her posture again. The faint smell of her perfume drifted across the table, sweet but strangely sharp in the still air. I waited for the attorney to explain the next steps, but my thoughts kept drifting. The weight of the moment pressed against my shoulders, making it hard to stay focused. I tried to remind myself that today was about closure, not conflict. I let my fingers rest lightly on the tabletop, feeling the cool, smooth surface beneath my skin. For a brief moment, the room felt suspended in time, as if everyone was holding their breath without realizing it. Even with all the tension, I felt a quiet hope settle in my chest. Maybe this really could be the final moment. We walked separate ways, without another argument. I straightened my posture, letting a slow breath ease through me as the meeting truly began. That first meeting after my parents passed should have been straightforward, but nothing about our family ever stayed simple for long. I remember sitting across from the attorney months ago, trying to process both grief and logistics at the same time. The room had a faint smell of coffee and old carpet, and I kept blinking hard, trying to stay composed. My sister sat beside me then, quiet but tense, her fingers tapping lightly on the arm of her chair. Even in that moment, A part of me sensed a shift between us, though I couldn't name it yet. Losing both parents in the same year had hollowed out the center of our family, leaving us with responsibilities neither of us felt ready to face. Every document we reviewed felt like a final goodbye, each signature a reminder of what we no longer had. I felt isolated in that pain, largely because my sister seemed to mourn in a different way, more outward, more dramatic, but somehow less connected. The attorney kept speaking in a calm, practiced tone, but I could feel the distance forming between my sister and me with every new detail shared. Probate stretched out longer than anyone expected, and the emotional weight of it wore me down slowly. Friends tried to understand, but it's hard to explain the exhaustion that comes from mixing grief with legal obligations. I stopped talking about it after a while because repeating the same frustrations made me feel like I was unraveling. My sister, meanwhile, drifted in and out of involvement. Some weeks she messaged constantly, demanding updates. Others she disappeared completely. The inconsistency made everything feel unstable. It left me handling most of the practical work on my own. That uneven effort added to the strain between us. I felt like I was holding the estate together while she floated above it all, dipping in only when it suited her. When the attorney revealed the estimated value of everything, I remember the deep, resonant silence that followed. Nearly $3 million. It didn't feel real at first, not when my parents had always lived modestly and rarely showed any signs of wealth. The house, the land, the investments, it was overwhelming. My breath caught in my chest, and my sister's eyes lit up in a way that unsettled me. I tried to remind myself that money brings out strange reactions in people. Maybe she was just shocked. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But something about her excitement didn't feel like grief mixing with relief. It felt like anticipation. As I sat there, listening to the attorney explain the next steps, I could feel the first crack form in my trust. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet shift, a tightening in my stomach that told me things might not go the way I hoped. We left that meeting without speaking much. She walked ahead of me, her heels clicking briskly across the floor, her posture unusually rigid. I noticed how she kept adjusting the strap of her purse, her movements rushed and uneven, as if she were fighting off nervous energy. Outside, the daylight felt too bright after the dim office. My throat felt dry, and I couldn't quite determine whether it was grief or something sharper. She gave me a quick nod before heading to her car, avoiding eye contact. It was small, but it lingered with me the whole drive home. The months that followed only deepened the divide. Every new update seemed to bring tension, even when it shouldn't have. I tried to approach things gently, double-checking decisions with her, keeping communication open, but she responded with short messages, clipped phrases, or dramatic outbursts depending on the day. I couldn't keep up with her shifting moods. Sometimes, late at night, I caught myself wondering if we had always been this mismatched or if grief had simply stripped away the illusions that used to hold us together. The uncertainty gnawed at me quietly. I began to notice a pattern in her behavior. Whenever a financial detail came up, investment breakdowns, property appraisals, insurance balances, her tone changed. She became more insistent, more probing, as if trying to gather information I didn't realize she wanted. She'd ask questions that felt rehearsed, then laugh them off when I hesitated. It left me uneasy, though I tried not to show it. I'd smile through the phone, even when my jaw felt tight. I told myself we were just handling stress differently, but denial only worked for so long. As the estate moved through its final stages, the emotional strain grew heavier. I could feel my patience thinning, though I tried to remain steady. It wasn't just the money, or the paperwork, or the endless signatures. It was the feeling that the one person who should have shared this burden with me was drifting further away with every passing week. Conversations became shorter. Eye contact faded. Even during our last meeting before the signing day, she sat with her arms crossed, her foot tapping a restless rhythm on the floor. Something unspoken filled the space between us. Still, I clung to the hope that once everything was finalized, we could put the tension behind us. Maybe time would soften the edges of our grief. Maybe clarity would come after closure. I held on to that belief more tightly than I admitted to anyone. As the day of the signing approached, I kept imagining the relief I would feel walking out of the courthouse for the last time. I told myself this would be the moment the weight lifted. I didn't realize then how wrong I was. Growing up, I always believed my sister and I shared a childhood that tied us together in a way nothing could break. At least, that's the version of the past I carried with me for most of my life. The truth was harder to see back then, buried under birthday parties, shared bedrooms, and the soft glow of nostalgia. When I look back now, I can feel the unevenness beneath those memories, like loose floorboards I stepped over without noticing. I remember the creak of them, but not the warning they offered. Our house was small, the kind where everyone could hear each other moving around. Mornings were filled with the sound of my mother stirring something on the stove, and my father humming off-key as he got ready for work. My sister and I would sit at the kitchen table, half awake, our cereal getting soggy as we argued about who got the last teaspoon of sugar. I used to think those moments meant closeness, but when I sift through them now, I notice how often she pushed boundaries, how often she took more than she needed simply because she knew I wouldn't fight her. Even little things had a familiar pattern. She'd borrow my things without asking, promise to return them, then pretend she forgot when they ended up broken or missing. I complained to our parents, but they always shrugged it off. She's the younger one, they'd say. Just let it go. Back then, the words felt harmless. Now they echo like the earliest signs of a habit that never truly changed. There was a moment when we were teenagers that sticks with me more sharply than I expected. We were supposed to clean the garage together, a chore my father insisted we both take seriously. I remember the dusty smell of old boxes and the chill that hung in the air even during summer. I was sorting tools when she slipped out the side door, leaving me alone with the mess. When my parents came to check on us, she returned with a bright smile and dirt smudged on her hands, claiming she had been working outside. They praised her for taking initiative, and I said nothing because I didn't want to start a fight. That silence became a familiar posture. Still, in my mind, we were a team. I was the steady one, and she was the unpredictable spark. We had long conversations in the dark after our parents went to bed, whispering secrets and making plans for the future. Those nights felt warm and safe, the kind where the glow of a bedside lamp made everything seem softer. I held on to those moments for years, convinced they proved we cared about each other deeply. But even then, I was always the listener, the comforter, the one offering support while she absorbed it all effortlessly. As we entered adulthood, the differences between us became clearer. I worked hard, piece by piece, building a quieter, more stable life. She chased excitement, changing jobs and relationships like seasons. But whenever she hit a wall, she would call me. I'd hear the tremble in her voice, picture her pacing whatever room she happened to be in, and I'd step in to help. I didn't see those moments as imbalances. I saw them as evidence that she trusted me. I didn't realize how easily trust could be mistaken for dependence. There were times, even back then, when I noticed hints of something unsettled beneath her charm. She could be sweet and generous, offering small gestures that made her seem thoughtful. But the sweetness faded quickly whenever she wanted something. Her tone shifted, and she would become sharper, more insistent. I learned to read the small cues. The way she tilted her head when she was about to ask for a favor. The way her smile tightened when she felt cornered. I ignored those cues for most of my life, because acknowledging them felt like betrayal. Looking back now, I can see the earliest signs of entitlement woven into our childhood. It showed up in the way she expected things, in the way our parents rushed to soften her disappointments. I don't blame them. They thought they were protecting her. But that protection grew into a shield she carried into adulthood, one that made her believe consequences were negotiable. I didn't see how dangerous that belief could become. I didn't see how it might one day turn against me. At the time, it just felt like family being family. Imperfect, messy, but stable enough to withstand the stresses of life. When I think about those childhood memories now, they feel strangely fragile, like old photographs that fade the longer you look at them. The echoes of laughter still exist, but they're layered with moments I once glossed over. Moments that should have made me pause. Moments that whispered truths I wasn't ready to hear. By the time we reached adulthood, I was already conditioned to smooth things over, to be the one who steadied the ground beneath us. I thought that meant we had a strong bond. I thought that meant she cared in the same way I did. but the version of closeness I believed in was built on uneven footing. That I just didn't understand that fully until much later. And even now, when I sift through the memories we shared, I can feel both warmth and weight in them. The warmth of what I thought we had, and the weight of everything I missed hiding underneath. As the estate process unfolded, I kept trying to tell myself that the tension between my sister and me was temporary. Something grief had carved into us that would eventually smooth out. But small moments kept piling up, subtle but undeniable, until they carried a weight I could no longer ignore. It wasn't one single argument or a dramatic shift. It was the accumulation of looks, pauses, and half-finished sentences that changed the tone of our conversations in ways neither of us addressed directly. I remember one afternoon when we met at the house to review an inventory list. The place felt colder than usual, as if the absence of our parents had seeped into the walls. Dust floated in the sunlight streaming through the living room windows, and the air held the faint scent of old books and wood polish. My sister walked from room to room without lingering, her eyes scanning quickly, almost restlessly. She barely touched anything, as though she were afraid of connecting with what remained. There was a moment when she stopped in front of our mother's sewing machine. She stared at it with a strange expression, nostalgic at first, but then guarded, as if she didn't want me to see whatever memory had surfaced. She brushed her hair behind her ear and turned away, too quickly for the moment to settle. I asked if she wanted to keep it, but she waved the question off, insisting it wasn't worth much. The dismissal felt too sharp, too practiced. I felt a quiet ache in my chest, but I let it pass. As we continued through the house, she began rushing me. Whenever I paused to look at something, a photograph, a piece of furniture, an old holiday decoration, she would sigh softly or shift her weight impatiently. At first, I assumed she was overwhelmed, but then I noticed how her attention snapped back whenever the conversation drifted toward anything financial. She asked about appraisals with a level of focus that surprised me. Her eyes narrowed slightly whenever I hesitated or told her I wasn't sure yet. It wasn't anger exactly, but there was an edge in her tone that didn't belong there. One evening, after a long day of sorting papers, I sat alone at my kitchen table reviewing the latest documents. The refrigerator hummed quietly behind me, and the glow of the overhead light cast soft shadows across the pages. That was when I noticed the first genuine red flag. She had requested copies of certain financial statements, but she hadn't asked me. She had gone directly to the attorney. When he mentioned it during our next call, his voice was casual, but the comment stuck with me. She had never done something like that before. It wasn't the request itself that bothered me. It was the secrecy behind it, the way she had bypassed me without explanation. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself she was simply taking initiative. But the unease settled into my chest like a slow, growing pressure. I found myself replaying small interactions, wondering if I had missed something important. The subtle defensiveness in her posture, the clipped tone in her messages, the way she avoided eye contact whenever money entered the conversation. Our next meeting at the attorney's office only deepened that sense of unease. She arrived late, offering a rushed excuse about traffic. Her hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a new coat I hadn't seen before. Expensive looking. She sat down across from me and immediately asked about the final valuation before the attorney could even begin. Her voice held a sharpness that made me sit back slightly. It wasn't aggressive, but it was undeniably urgent. The attorney glanced at me, then at her, sensing the tension even if neither of us acknowledged it. He answered her questions with his usual calm professionalism, but I found myself studying her more than I listened. Her fingers tapped the table lightly, her eyes scanning the documents with an intensity that felt unfamiliar. I'd never seen her this focused on anything related to responsibility. It felt like watching someone I knew wearing a version of themselves that didn't quite fit. Later that night, I tried calling her, hoping to reconnect, hoping to ease the tension before it grew any worse. She didn't answer. Instead, she sent a short message an hour later. Busy. Talk tomorrow. No punctuation, no warmth. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, feeling a hollowness spread through my chest. I knew that tone. It was the same one she used whenever she wanted distance, whenever she was hiding something she didn't want me to ask about. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness I couldn't shake. I brewed coffee, the smell filling the quiet kitchen, and sat at the table again, trying to gather my thoughts. Little memories floated up uninvited. Times when she had twisted a story to her advantage. Times when she had convinced our parents to side with her by making herself seem vulnerable. Times when I had stepped aside to avoid conflict, thinking it was easier to give in than to push back. For the first time, I wondered if my habit of accommodating her had taught her something dangerous, something that was now resurfacing in the most critical moment of our lives. Even then, I didn't want to assume the worst. I didn't want to believe she was capable of turning this into something ugly. But deep down, beneath all the rationalizations, I could feel a truth trying to surface. Something wasn't right. Something had shifted between us in a way that no amount of grief could explain away. And as much as I wanted to deny it, I could feel myself bracing for whatever was coming next. By the time we reached the midpoint of the estate process, I had started paying closer attention to patterns. Small behaviors I had once overlooked, habits I had learned to normalize, because they were easier to ignore than confront. But now, with millions of dollars involved, those patterns no longer felt harmless. They felt like warning signs I should have recognized much earlier. I found myself replaying old memories, not because I wanted to dwell on them, but because they suddenly carried new meaning. There was one afternoon in particular that lingered in my mind. We had planned to meet at the house again, this time to go through our father's office. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old printer ink, a scent I had always associated with his stability. Papers were neatly stacked, and his handwriting filled the margins of half-finished projects. When I stepped inside, I expected to feel sad, maybe overwhelmed. Instead, I felt uneasy. My sister was already there, sorting through a drawer with an urgency that didn't match the task. She didn't look up when I entered. Her shoulders were stiff, her movements quick and almost frantic. I asked if she was okay, and she just nodded without elaborating. Something about the way she avoided my eyes made my stomach tighten. She kept tucking documents into a small pile next to her, flipping through them too fast to actually read anything. When I asked what she had found, she gave a vague answer. Just old stuff, and slid the papers deeper into the drawer before moving to another. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. But later, when I went back through that drawer after she left, I realized several folders were missing. Nothing crucial, no financial paperwork or legal documents, but items that felt personal. Letters, notes, things my father had kept tucked away. I felt a strange mixture of confusion and sadness. Why those? Why hide them? I had no answers, only a growing sense of imbalance between us. Around that same time, I started noticing changes in how she communicated. Or rather, how she avoided communicating. Short texts, missed calls, responses that seemed too carefully phrased, as if she were filtering information rather than simply speaking to me. When we met in person, she shifted in her seat often, her gaze darting away whenever I mentioned timelines or valuations. She kept asking when the final meeting would be scheduled, her tone hovering between impatience and anxiety. One evening, I sat in my car outside the house, the engine off and the quiet settling around me like a blanket. The sky had dimmed into a soft blue, and crickets chirped faintly from the yard. I stayed there for almost 15 minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to understand the uneasiness twisting through me. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was suspicion, gentle, creeping, and unwelcome. I hated that I felt it. I hated that it was directed at the person I had trusted more consistently than anyone else. Still, part of me kept trying to rationalize everything. She'd always been impulsive, always moved quickly when she felt overwhelmed. Maybe this was just her way of coping. Maybe she needed more control over the process to feel secure. I went back and forth in circles, convincing myself the tension was temporary, only to feel the doubt return again and again. The next significant moment came during a call with the attorney. He mentioned an email thread I hadn't been included in, one where my sister had asked increasingly pointed questions about how the funds would be distributed and whether early access to any portion was possible. His tone remained professional, but I could hear something cautious beneath it. When I asked for details, he hesitated before explaining that she had inquired about transferring assets before the final signatures, something that wasn't allowed. I sat there in silence, listening to his measured voice while my mind raced. Why would she even attempt that? Why would she keep it from me? The questions dug into me with a persistence I couldn't ignore anymore. For the first time, the possibility crossed my mind that she wasn't just overwhelmed. She was planning something. The thought felt like swallowing cold metal. After the call ended, I walked around my living room, the soft creak of the wooden floor following each step. I ran my hand along the back of the couch, grounding myself in the familiar texture. My breathing felt uneven. I didn't want to accuse her of anything without proof. I didn't want to see her as someone I couldn't trust. But the evidence was mounting in quiet, unmistakable ways. Then came the moment that finally shifted something in me. She showed up at my house unexpectedly, claiming she wanted to clarify something about the documents. Her voice was light, but her eyes flickered with something sharper. She glanced around my living room as if searching for something. When we sat down, she leaned forward, clasping her hands so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. She asked if I had spoken to the attorney recently. The question sounded innocent, but her tone was strained. I told her yes, and watched the subtle tension in her shoulders tighten further. She smiled, but it was thin, almost brittle. She said she wanted to make sure we were on the same page. And the phrase hit me harder than it should have. It felt less like a reassurance and more like a warning disguised as concern. When she left, I stood at the doorway watching her walk to her car. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and her figure moved through them quickly, almost nervously. I closed the door slowly, feeling a quiet shift settle inside me. For the first time, I realized I would need to be careful. Not dramatic, not confrontational, just careful. Whatever was happening, it was no longer just grief or stress. Something else was unfolding beneath the surface, and I could feel myself stepping into unfamiliar territory, even if I didn't yet understand where it would lead. The day everything shifted felt ordinary at first, the kind of day that wouldn't stand out in memory unless something significant happened to anchor it there. I woke up early, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. The morning light came in through the blinds in thin, uneven stripes. Nothing about the moment suggested I was about to stumble onto something that would change the entire course of the estate process, and the fragile trust one had left in my sister. I had planned to spend the morning reviewing a few loose ends, small tasks the attorney had asked us to double-check before the final paperwork. I opened my laptop, expecting the usual emails and reminders. Instead, the first thing I noticed was a notification that surprised me. It came from the shared drive our attorney had set up for both of us, the space where all documents were stored, so everything remained transparent. At least, that was the intention. The notification said a file had been moved. Not opened, not viewed, moved. I felt a quiet pinch of suspicion, not sharp enough to be alarming, but strong enough to make me click without hesitation. When the drive opened, I noticed instantly that one folder was missing. It was the folder containing the most recent appraisal documents, critical pieces of information outlining the total value of the estate, including the exact valuation of the property and assets. My first instinct was to assume it was a glitch. Shared drives sometimes acted strangely. Maybe the file had been archived automatically or relocated by accident. I refreshed the page twice, then again, feeling a slight tension building in my jaw. When it still didn't appear, I checked the activity log. That's when I saw her name. She had moved the folder at 11:43 p.m. the night before. My stomach tightened, a slow, heavy knot forming. It wasn't the late hour that bothered me. It was the secrecy, the deliberate action, the timing. I stared at the log, reading her name over and over as if the entry might change if I blinked long enough. It didn't. I searched through the entire drive until I finally found the folder tucked inside a different directory, one labeled with an old internal code the attorney hadn't used since the beginning. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it was placed somewhere I never would have thought to look unless I was digging for it. The act itself wasn't overtly malicious, but it was undeniably intentional. When I opened the folder, another detail unsettled me. Several documents had been downloaded individually, each time stamped around the same time the previous night. Not all at once, one at 11:50, another at 12:03, another at 12:17. The staggered downloads made my skin prickle. It felt like she had been studying them quietly, carefully, and without involving me at all. I leaned back in my chair, pressing my palms to my forehead. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. I rubbed my hands together slowly, trying to settle the restlessness growing inside me. Part of me wanted to call her instantly and demand an explanation. Another part knew doing that would only tip her off that I was paying attention now. So instead, I closed the laptop and sat there listening to the faint ticking of the wall clock. I tried to make sense of what I had seen, to trace back all the moments that might have hinted at this. Every clipped conversation, every delayed reply, every time she avoided meeting my eyes, it all began fitting together in ways that made too much sense. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, needing air. The cold breeze caught me immediately, brushing against my skin and clearing some of the fog in my mind. I walked down the driveway slowly, hearing the crunch of gravel beneath my shoes. I wasn't angry, not yet. What I felt was deeper, something like quiet disbelief mixed with a kind of exhaustion that settled deep in my bones. I had always given her the benefit of the doubt, always assumed the best, always stepped back to avoid conflict. But now, the pieces didn't look like misunderstandings. They looked like a pattern, a familiar one I had ignored for far too long. Later that afternoon, I met with the attorney over a video call. He greeted me with his usual calm professionalism, but he noticed my tense expression immediately. When he asked if everything was all right, I hesitated. I didn't want to accuse her prematurely, but I couldn't ignore the situation either. So I asked him a simple question, whether he had moved any files recently. His answer was immediate and firm. No, not a single document had been altered on his end. He quickly checked his access logs, and when he confirmed that she had indeed moved the folder on her own, his expression shifted slightly. Not shock, not alarm, but something more cautious. He asked if I had spoken to her about it. I told him no. I didn't explain why, but he seemed to understand. The call ended with a subtle warning disguised as reassurance. He reminded me that all actions were recorded and nothing could be changed without review. His tone was gentle but clear. He was telling me that the system was safe, but I needed to keep my eyes open. When the call ended, I sat there staring at my reflection in the darkened laptop screen. My face looked unfamiliar, tired, wary. I felt a heaviness settle across my shoulders, the kind that came from recognizing a truth I didn't want to accept. Something had begun, something deliberate, something she wasn't telling me. And for the first time, I felt a quiet certainty rising inside me. Not fear, not anger, but awareness. The kind that changes how you look at someone forever. I didn't intend to start digging, but once suspicion settles into the mind, it becomes almost impossible to shake loose. I found myself scanning old emails, old texts, even old voicemails that I had ignored when they first came in. Most of them were harmless, birthday wishes, check-ins, occasional updates about our mother, but one thread caught my attention. It was a chain between Emily and a man named Grant, someone I didn't recognize. The messages weren't romantic, but they carried a tone of urgency and hushed planning. I read them twice, then a third time, feeling the tiny hairs on my arms rise with each reread. I told myself I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. People make new friends all the time, but there was something about the timestamps, the clip language, and the repetition of certain phrases, timing, access, need confirmation. That didn't feel casual. I sat there with my phone in my hand, staring at her messages like they were written in invisible ink, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. That night, I slept restlessly. The house felt colder than usual, and the sound of the wind outside seemed sharper, more intrusive. I woke up twice from dreams I couldn't remember, only the sensation of unease lingering like a weight on my chest. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. I told myself that grief and responsibility were making me see patterns where there were none. But the moment morning light hit the room, the doubts were still there, sitting quietly at the back of my mind. I decided to test something. Instead of calling her like I did most mornings, I waited. I wanted to see if she would reach out first. She didn't. Hours passed with no text, no missed call, nothing. I told myself it didn't matter. Siblings don't need to talk every day. But something about the silence felt deliberate. I couldn't help thinking it was timed, purposeful, aligned with something I didn't yet understand. By noon, the tension in my stomach had become a steady throb. I grabbed my keys and drove to her place. The air smelled like early fall, dry leaves mixed with the faint scent of pine, and it grounded me just enough to keep my hand steady on the steering wheel. When I pulled up to her house, I noticed her car was gone. Not unusual, but still something I clocked without meaning to. Old habits of keeping track, I guess. I walked up to the porch, knocked, waited. Nothing. I knocked again. Still nothing. My nerves were starting to fray in a way I couldn't ignore. Just when I was about to leave, I spotted something tucked near her doorframe. A slip of paper, crumpled slightly at the edges. I bent down to grab it, feeling the rough wood of the porch boards beneath my palm as I steadied myself. It was a delivery notice. A package requiring signature had arrived the day before, but wasn't picked up. That wasn't like her. Emily adored getting packages. She practically built rituals around unboxing things. I stood there staring at the notice, like it might reveal something deeper. Instead, it simply made my chest tighten. Something was off. I couldn't name it, but I felt it in the way a person feels a storm brewing long before the clouds gather. I drove to the cafe where she liked to work when she needed a change of scenery. When I walked inside, the warm smell of roasted beans and cinnamon usually comforted me, but today it only sharpened my nerves. I scanned the tables, hoping to catch her hunched over a laptop or flipping through papers. She wasn't there. I ordered a black coffee half out of habit, half out of a need to look like I had a purpose, then took a seat near the window. As I sat there, I remembered the messages, timing, access, need confirmation. The words echoed in my mind in a way that made them feel heavier now. I wonder who Grant was. I wondered what he needed access to. And more importantly, why she was involved in any of it. Emily wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. If she was making plans behind my back, there had to be a reason. But no matter how many explanations I tried to conjure, none of them made sense. None of them fit the sister I thought I knew. I kept coming back to one thought, one that twisted inside me with every minute that passed. She was hiding something, and whatever it was, it involved the estate. I finished my coffee without tasting it. The cup felt warm in my hands, but I felt cold inside. I checked my phone again. Still nothing from her. No missed calls, no texts. I decided to drive by the lawyer's office next. Maybe she had a meeting she forgot to mention, or maybe she'd gone there to discuss something I wasn't supposed to know about. When I arrived, the building looked the same as always, quiet, professional, a little too sterile. I didn't go inside. I just sat in the parking lot, staring at the glass doors, imagining her walking through them, with a plan I had no part in. The thought tightened something deep in my chest. Eventually, I drove home. The house felt heavier than usual when I walked in, like it absorbed the tension I brought with me. I placed my keys on the counter and exhaled slowly, letting the weight of the day settle in my bones. I didn't know what Emily was doing or why she was doing it, but I knew one thing for certain. Something was shifting between us, something subtle but dangerous, and I wasn't ready to face what that meant. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of heaviness I couldn't shake, like the air itself had thickened overnight. I moved slowly through the kitchen, the cool tile pressing against my bare feet, while the faint smell of last night's coffee lingered in the room. I kept checking my phone even though I knew it was pointless. Emily still hadn't reached out. No missed calls. No texts. No explanations. The silence had turned from concerning to oppressive, wrapping itself around every thought I tried to form. I tried distracting myself with tasks that usually helped clear my mind. Laundry, dishes, sweeping the porch, but nothing stuck. My hands went through the motions, while my brain spiraled in quiet circles. Every time I pictured her, it was like trying to frame a moving target. Her face kept shifting between the sister I trusted and the stranger those hidden messages hinted she might be becoming. By midday, I couldn't sit with the uncertainty anymore. I drove to the storage unit, where we kept boxes from our parents' home. I told myself I was there to grab a few old documents, but deep down I knew it was something else. I needed to see if anything was missing. I needed to know she hadn't already taken something without telling me. The sun was harsh, reflecting off the metal doors in sharp flashes that made my eyes water. I punched in the code and stepped inside, the cool air brushing against my arms like a reminder to breathe. The unit looked untouched. Boxes stacked neatly, Labels in my handwriting and hers. The smell of old cardboard and dust felt familiar, grounding. I walked between the stacks, pulling open lids at random. Everything looked the same, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something invisible had shifted. A subtle imbalance I couldn't name. I stood there a moment longer, resting my hand on one of the boxes marked Dad's papers. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on my chest, both the literal weight of the boxes and the emotional weight of carrying everything alone. When I stepped outside, I saw a car turning sharply into the lot. A dark sedan I didn't recognize. It slowed when it passed me, the driver's face mostly hidden by sunglasses and a tilted baseball cap. For a second, our eyes met, or at least I felt like they did. A chill ran up my spine. The car didn't park. It just looped around and exited through the far gate. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was coincidence. But the unease clung to me like static. I tried calling Emily again, straight to voicemail. Her recorded message, cheerful and familiar, felt suddenly out of place with everything else happening. I didn't leave a message. I hung up and got back in my car, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly as I pulled onto the road. The wind rattled through the open window, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant exhaust. Everything looked normal outside, but inside I felt like I was tracking cracks that only I could see. By the time I got home, I had convinced myself I was overreacting, that the sedan meant nothing, that the silence meant nothing. I tried to settle into the couch, tried to distract myself with a documentary, but my mind refused to stay still. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, even my own breathing. When my phone finally buzzed, I nearly dropped it. But it wasn't Emily. It was an email alert, new activity on the estate account. A withdrawal request had been initiated. Not completed, but initiated. And the amount made my blood run cold. $3 million. The exact figure I'd been discussing with the attorneys. The exact number that wasn't supposed to move until both of us signed together. The room seemed to tilt for a moment, the air thinning around me. My pulse hammered in my ears. I clicked the activity log, scanning the details with trembling fingers. The request had come from a device not registered to me. The username associated with the access attempt wasn't hers either. It was Grant W. Grant, the same name from the messages. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I stood up, pacing the living room, fingers digging into my palms. I couldn't make sense of it. If Emily was working with this man, why? What could she possibly gain from sneaking around like this? And how did he even know about the account? The only people who knew those details were me, Emily, and our lawyers. I grabbed my bag and keys with no real plan, just the instinctive need to move, to do something, to stop feeling helpless. I drove back to her house, my heartbeat sinking with every turn I made. When I pulled up, her car was in the driveway this time. That alone made my breath hitch. I parked behind her and stepped out, noticing the faint sound of voices coming from inside. Not loud, but enough that I could tell she wasn't alone. I approached the door quietly, each step making the wooden boards creak under my weight. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob, feeling the cool metal against my fingertips. Something inside me braced for impact, the way a body tenses just before a crash. Before I knocked, the voices inside suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was sharp and immediate, cutting through the air like a blade. And in that stillness, I felt it confirmation. Not imagined, not exaggerated, real. She was hiding something, and I had just stepped directly into the middle of it. After that day, the tension didn't just linger, it expanded, filling every corner of my mind and every interaction I had with my sister. I tried to act normal, to go about routine tasks, as if nothing had changed, but the knowledge of what I discovered weighed too heavily to ignore. Every phone vibration, every unexpected message, made my pulse skip. I couldn't tell if I was preparing for confrontation or just bracing for more betrayal, but either way, I couldn't stop myself from noticing the patterns I had once overlooked. The attorney called a few days later to remind us of a meeting regarding the final signatures. He mentioned that all documentation had been reviewed, that nothing was missing, and that the process was moving forward as planned. On the surface, his voice was calm and professional, but I could detect a slight tension under his words, as if he, too, had noticed that something wasn't quite right. That tiny hint of unease mirrored my own, making the air feel heavier, more charged, as if we were all quietly aware of a storm about to break. I arrived at the office first, taking a seat near the window. The fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the room, reflecting off the polished table like a reminder of the sterile, controlled environment we were about to enter. My sister arrived shortly after, her movements deliberate and precise, her gaze scanning the room with a cautious intensity. She gave me a brief nod, too brief, too calculated, and took her seat. The way she sat, shoulders stiff, hands clasped tightly in front of her, spoke volumes I didn't yet want to admit. As the attorney began reviewing the agenda, I noticed something subtle but undeniable. Her eyes flicked repeatedly to the corner of the room where the safe deposit documents were stacked. She didn't glance at me. She didn't even meet my gaze once. Her focus was trained entirely on the paper, her movements calculated, careful. The behavior alone set off alarms in my mind, but I had to keep my composure. Showing suspicion now would alert her that I was paying closer attention. Throughout the meeting, I felt the room shrink around me. Each explanation from the attorney felt heavier than the last, each detail of the signing process somehow carrying more weight than it should. My sister asked questions, but they were pointed in a way that suggested she wasn't just curious, she was probing. She needed to know, and she wasn't hiding the need anymore. Her tone was measured, polite, but underneath it was a tension that I had learned to recognize, a silent pressure, a prelude to maneuvering I wasn't yet aware of. After the attorney stepped out briefly to make a call, I found myself staring at her, trying to decipher the expression she held. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table, a rhythmic beat that mirrored the unease thrumming through me. Her lips pressed together in a thin line, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Every subtle cue, every micro-expression, was like a tiny flare signaling the truth I had been avoiding. Something was happening, and she was orchestrating it quietly, efficiently. When the attorney returned, she spoke again, her words carefully chosen, the cadence deliberate. I noticed how her sentences were structured in a way that guided the conversation toward specific points that always touched on timing, access, or financial leverage. She wasn't overtly aggressive, but the intention was clear. She was testing boundaries. She was feeling out what I knew and how far she could push without being stopped. Later, when we left the office, I tried to process the meeting without tipping into panic. The sunlight outside felt harsh, highlighting every detail of her movements, the crisp click of her heels, the way she straightened her coat as if preparing for something. Even her smile when the attorney waved goodbye seemed rehearsed, calculated to appear casual while hiding something beneath. I could feel the distance between us stretching wider with every step, widening into a space that felt impossible to bridge without confrontation or vigilance. Over the next few days, the behavior escalated in subtle ways. She began asking for documents earlier in the morning, questioning timelines and emails that previously would have gone unnoticed. She started making small moves that seemed insignificant at first, a note left in a folder, a marked-up page in a report, but together, they created a pattern I could no longer ignore. The careful orchestration was becoming obvious, and every action made me more certain that this wasn't mere oversight or stress. I found myself walking a delicate line. I couldn't confront her directly yet, not without proof or a plan. I had to watch, observe, anticipate. The idea of her making a move, without my knowledge, filled me with a quiet urgency. I spent hours retracing steps, reviewing emails and documents, trying to discern what she might attempt next. Every observation reinforced the same terrifying thought. She was capable of taking advantage of the system we had both trusted. By the time the weekend arrived, the sense of danger had shifted from abstract to real. I stayed alert, reviewing every interaction, every exchange of information. I noticed things I would have ignored before. The slight hesitation before she opened a document, the way she carefully avoided eye contact, the subtle way she monitored the attorney's responses. Everything was becoming a chessboard, and I realized that if I didn't act with intelligence and precision, I would be left entirely unprepared. For the first time, I understood the true stakes. It wasn't just about money. It was about trust, control, and the very foundation of the relationship I thought we had. And in that understanding, the gravity of what was coming settled into my chest, heavy and insistent, like a warning I could no longer ignore. The escalation continued in ways I couldn't ignore. Each small move, by my sister sharpening the tension like a knife edge. I began noticing the subtleties that had always been easy to dismiss. Slight delays in response, the careful choice of words, the way she lingered near the documents I was reviewing without actually offering help. Every action was precise, calculated, and designed to test boundaries. The trust one had once given freely now felt fragile, stretched thin across a battlefield I hadn't realized existed. It started with small anomalies in the document logs. Files I had thought were secure had been accessed at odd hours. Nothing was missing, but the pattern was unmistakable. She wasn't clumsy. She was intentional. The realization made my stomach tighten with unease, and I began double-checking everything, obsessively tracing each step in the shared records. I felt a familiar prickle of tension under my skin, the sense that someone I had trusted completely was quietly maneuvering around me. Emails became a minefield. I noticed her phrasing shifting subtly, questions appearing more pointed than casual. She would ask for clarifications about values, timelines, or processes in ways that hinted at prior knowledge I hadn't given her. At first, I tried to assume she was just curious or overthinking. But the more I reviewed, the clearer it became that she wasn't just curious, she was gathering intelligence. And I was suddenly playing defense, without even knowing the game. One afternoon, I walked into the study, where I usually sorted through the final estate documents. The room smelled faintly of paper and old leather, comforting in an almost nostalgic way. But when I reached for a folder, I noticed a subtle shift in its placement. It had been moved, angled slightly differently, like someone had handled it carefully but deliberately. My chest tightened. I knew immediately that she had been there, quietly surveying the same papers I had spent hours reviewing. It was a small act, almost imperceptible, but the intention behind it was clear. That evening, I couldn't focus on anything else. I paced the living room, the wooden floor creaking beneath my steps, the faint hum of the refrigerator a constant reminder of silence that felt heavy. I realized that I had been giving her far too much freedom, far too many blind spots. The naivety of assuming she would act fairly now seemed almost dangerous. I started retracing every past action, every moment where I had overlooked her subtle manipulations. Patterns emerged, each one sharper than the last. I knew I had to be methodical. I couldn't confront her outright, not yet. Any direct accusation would alert her, and I needed clarity first. I began documenting everything. Timestamps, small behaviors, anything that hinted at her intentions. The process was painstaking, exhausting, but it was the only way to regain control over the situation. I felt like a detective in my own life, piecing together subtle signs that someone I had loved and trusted might betray me completely. Late one night, I caught a glimpse of her on a video call, the screen glowing dimly in the otherwise dark room. She wasn't speaking loudly, but her gestures were deliberate, almost rehearsed. Her eyes flicked toward a stack of papers in the corner, then back to the camera. Every movement suggested she was strategizing, planning, anticipating the next steps. In a process she expected to manipulate. It was clear she had allies I hadn't considered, people aware of information that hadn't been shared with me. The sense of betrayal was sharp, immediate, like cold air hitting my chest. I tried calling her the next morning, my voice measured but tense. She answered casually, her tone light, as if nothing had shifted. But beneath the calm, I could hear a subtle precision in her words, the way she skirted certain topics and redirected the conversation toward trivial details. It was a skill I had never seen her wield before, and it unsettled me profoundly. She was capable of deception I hadn't anticipated, and the reality of it sank in slowly, painfully. Over the next few days, the behavior escalated. She began requesting documents earlier in the morning, following up with questions designed to gauge my awareness. She would arrive unexpectedly to review certain records, her presence calm but deliberate, a silent pressure filling the room. Every interaction became a test, a subtle probing into my knowledge, my intentions, and my trust. I realized then that the final signing was no longer a simple procedural step. It was a battleground. By the end of the week, I felt the full weight of what was happening. The estate, the documents, the shared trust between us. It had become a silent war. She was no longer just my sister. She was a strategist, calculating and cautious, always one step ahead in ways I had only just begun to understand. And I knew, with a quiet but undeniable certainty, that if I didn't act carefully, I would lose far more than money. I would lose control, clarity, and perhaps even the bond one had once believed unbreakable. The tension reached a new level the day we were supposed to finalize the documents. I woke up with a hollow weight in my chest, the kind of heaviness that seeps into your bones before the mind fully registers danger. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, highlighting dust motes that floated lazily in the air, but I barely noticed. My focus was on her, on Emily, and the web of small betrayals and evasions that had accumulated over the past weeks. Each step she had taken, each subtle maneuver, was now part of a pattern I could no longer ignore. I arrived at the attorney's office early, my hands trembling slightly as I set down my briefcase. The office smelled faintly of polished wood and old books, a comforting familiarity that did little to ease the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. I sat by the window, staring at the parking lot as people and cars moved past without a care, entirely unaware of the storm that had been quietly building inside our family. I ran through the list of documents, the final steps, everything in my mind, and tried to anticipate what Emily might do next. When she arrived, I noticed immediately the difference in her demeanor. Her movements were controlled, deliberate, almost rehearsed. Her usual easy smile was in place, but there was a tension beneath it, subtle but unmistakable. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, the kind that made others underestimate the seriousness of her intentions. The faint click of her heels on the tile echoed in the room, punctuating the weight of the moment. I felt the air tighten around me, as though the office itself was aware of the silent conflict brewing between us. The attorney began reviewing the final forms, reading clauses and confirming details as he always did. But Emily's attention was elsewhere, flicking from document to document, her eyes scanning rapidly, memorizing, calculating. Every so often, she'd glance in my direction, not with affection or curiosity, but with a careful, measured look, as if testing boundaries and probing for weaknesses. I tried to maintain composure, but the subtle challenge in her gaze made my stomach clench. At one point, she asked a question about a minor clause that had been discussed and settled weeks before. Her voice was casual, but her wording suggested something more, a veiled attempt to gauge my knowledge, to see if I had overlooked anything. I answered cautiously, aware that any misstep could be an opening she would seize. She nodded, a small, polite motion that felt like both a victory and a warning. Every interaction had become a chess move, each one layered with intention and unseen consequences. After the attorney stepped out briefly, I noticed her taking a folder from the table. She held it delicately, flipping through pages with precision, as though memorizing every detail, every number, every signature line. The way she handled the documents suggested experience and premeditation. I felt a cold, sinking feeling, the kind that spreads from your chest down to your limbs. She wasn't just participating, she was preparing to act in a way I hadn't anticipated. When the attorney returned, she slid the folder back into place and smiled, polite, unobtrusive, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. They were sharp, calculating, and I could feel the distance between us grow, stretching into a space that neither of us could cross. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made, carried the weight of intention I couldn't yet decipher. I realized that this was no longer just about the documents. It was about control, about who would emerge on the other side intact, unmanipulated. Later, I watched her from across the table, noting how she adjusted her seating subtly, the way she positioned her hands, the careful timing of her responses. Everything was measured, precise, and I understood in that moment that she had been rehearsing. She had been observing, calculating, and quietly orchestrating the steps that would give her an advantage. My heart sank with the realization. I had underestimated her, assumed the worst wouldn't happen, assumed trust would prevail. But here she was, silently challenging that assumption. The minutes crawled. Each signature, each check mark, felt like a gauntlet. I had to be vigilant with every movement, every word, every glance. I kept my hand steady, tried to maintain an even tone, but internally, I was preparing, plotting in a quiet, careful way. I knew that the slightest slip could cost me not just money, but the clarity, integrity, and control I had worked so hard to maintain. By the time we were nearly done, I could feel the tension pressing against my ribs like a physical weight. Her eyes flicked to the last pages, and I caught a moment, a twitch in her fingers, a tightening of her jaw, that told me she was about to act. I didn't know what it would be, but instinct screamed that something irreversible was imminent. And in that instant, I understood fully that this wasn't just a financial matter. It was a battle of wits, timing, and subtle intelligence, and it had already begun. I exhaled slowly, the quiet hum of the office suddenly louder in my ears. The room, the documents, the people, they all faded to background as I focused on one truth. The moment had arrived where decisions would be made, intentions revealed, and consequences unavoidable. And I braced myself, knowing that the next few minutes would define everything that followed. The revelation came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow stretching across the room while I was still focused elsewhere. I had been reviewing the last stack of documents, my fingers tracing the fine print, my mind replaying every small behavior, every subtle maneuver from the past weeks. That's when I noticed it, a small discrepancy in one of the transfer forms. A detail so minute I almost dismissed it, but something in my gut told me to look closer. I leaned in, squinting at the numbers and account details, and the truth hit me with a force that left me frozen. Emily had moved money, millions of dollars, without authorization. The accounts she touched weren't just the ordinary estate accounts. They were the ones tied to the assets we were supposed to share equally, the ones meant to be signed off jointly at the final meeting. She had orchestrated the transfer subtly, using access codes and timing that made the transactions appear routine to anyone glancing casually at the logs. But the irregularities were there, hidden in plain sight, like tiny cracks in a foundation I hadn't noticed before. I sank into my chair, the office air suddenly heavier. My mind raced through every interaction over the past weeks, the emails, the texts, the unusual questions she had asked, her precise and careful handling of the documents. Everything suddenly clicked into place. The patterns I had observed weren't coincidences. They were deliberate, and the weight of that realization settled deep in my chest, cold and undeniable. I couldn't act impulsively. I knew that, if I confronted her now, she would have a chance to cover her tracks, to manipulate the situation further. I took a deep breath, letting my hands rest lightly on the table, feeling the textured surface beneath my fingertips. I had to think several moves ahead, just as she had, to protect what was mine and ensure that justice, quiet, precise, and deserved, was possible. The attorney returned just as I was piecing it together. His calm demeanor belied the tension I felt pressing into my shoulders. I told him I needed to review the transactions in detail, to double-check every entry, and he agreed, offering assistance without question. Together, we traced the movements, reconstructing the timeline of how Emily had subtly manipulated access. Each step revealed more: small withdrawals, slight rerouting of transfers, confirmations sent only to secondary accounts. It was meticulous work, executed with patience and planning. I realized then that this wasn't an act of desperation or carelessness. It was a calculated betrayal. She had spent weeks quietly positioning herself to gain the upper hand, testing boundaries, and probing for weaknesses. Her allies, or at least one person, the mysterious Grant, had provided assistance or guidance, ensuring that her actions remained undetected until now. The reality of it left me breathless, the betrayal cutting sharper than I could have imagined. Sitting there, I replayed moments that had seemed minor at the time. Her quick glances at my hands, the subtle hesitation before she spoke, the casual but pointed questions about access and timing. They were all part of a carefully laid plan, a rehearsal she had perfected over weeks. Every instinct I had ignored, every red flag I had rationalized away, now screamed loudly in my mind. I had seen the signs, but I hadn't recognized their significance until the truth was unavoidable. I spent hours reconstructing the timeline, charting her steps and correlating them with the account logs. Each detail reinforced the reality that she had acted independently, deliberately, and with intent. The enormity of the $3 million transfer, a figure I had barely allowed myself to grasp, was staggering. But even more staggering was the realization that she had done it without a single direct confrontation. Every move had been calculated, silent, and precise. Despite the shock, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, I understood exactly what I was facing. Emily's plan wasn't impulsive, it was methodical. But methodical mistakes can be undone if you recognize the pattern. Her confidence, her precision, her careful orchestration, all of it now offered me insight into how to act. I could anticipate her next moves because I had seen the structure of her strategy. By late afternoon, I began to formulate a plan. Not impulsive revenge, but careful, intelligent action that would correct the imbalance without creating chaos. I knew I had to gather evidence, document every irregularity, and act in a way that would protect the estate while exposing the betrayal. The shock and betrayal remained, but beneath it, a quiet determination settled in. I was no longer the one being manipulated. I had clarity, foresight, and the advantage of knowing the truth. Sitting alone in the office, I let the silence stretch. The faint hum of the air conditioning filled the room, mingling with the steady ticking of the wall clock. I traced the sequence of her actions one final time, letting the magnitude of the revelation sink in fully. The betrayal was real, deliberate, and personal, but so was the opportunity to act decisively. And in that still, quiet moment, I resolved to reclaim control, to restore balance, and to ensure that justice would be delivered in a way that was earned, meticulous, and unassailable. The next few days were a study in quiet observation. I moved carefully, deliberately, tracking Emily's actions without making my presence obvious. Every step she took, every phone call, every question about account details or document placement was recorded in my mind, cataloged for later use. I knew I couldn't confront her openly, not yet, but the knowledge I had gained gave me a subtle power I hadn't felt in weeks. The balance had shifted, and I was no longer simply reacting. I was planning. It started with small, intentional experiments. I left documents in slightly different folders, altered timestamps in minor ways, and noted how she responded. The slightest hesitation, the micro-expressions she exhibited when discovering changes, gave me insight into how far she was willing to push, how quickly she could adapt. She was intelligent and cautious, but she was also predictable once the pattern became clear. Watching her, I realized that her precision could be turned against her if I remained patient. Then came the conversation that would expose everything. It wasn't dramatic or loud. There was no shouting, no immediate confrontation. We were reviewing one of the lesser-used accounts together when I asked a simple question, casually phrased, about a recent transaction. Her hands paused mid-motion. Her eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, toward the screen, then back to me. There was a subtle tightening in her jaw. The pause wasn't long, but it was enough. I leaned slightly forward, voice calm, steady. This transaction, can you walk me through it? Just so I understand. My tone was conversational, almost indifferent, but the underlying message was clear. I knew. She froze, and I saw it in that moment. The split second of realization when she understood that I had connected the dots. Her carefully constructed facade faltered just slightly. The first crack I had been waiting for. The next moments were delicate, almost surgical. She tried to recover with practiced composure, speaking in soft, measured tones about timing errors and minor misunderstandings. But her explanations faltered under my quiet questioning, the subtle but precise inquiries I had prepared. Every excuse, every diversion, fell apart in the face of documented evidence I had already reviewed and organized. It was almost painful to watch, the precision she had relied upon now working against her, the truth unfolding quietly but unmistakably. When the reality became undeniable, the shift in her demeanor was instantaneous. Her shoulders sagged slightly, the controlled rhythm of her movements giving way to small, nervous gestures. Her eyes, which had always been sharp and calculating, now reflected something else, a recognition that the game had changed. She was no longer the one orchestrating. She was on the defensive. It was subtle, yes, but I could feel it radiate through the room like a slow, electric current. I remained calm, steady, allowing the truth to present itself fully. No accusations. No emotional outbursts. Just evidence, observation, and quiet, unshakable clarity. She tried again, proposing alternative explanations, rationalizing transfers and accesses, but the facts were undeniable. The timeline, the movements, the careful manipulations. It all pointed to one conclusion. She had taken advantage of the system, intentionally, and now she had no room left to maneuver. As I watched, I noticed the last ally she had leaned on, the one who had enabled small manipulations and hidden details, beginning to fade from the equation. Emails she had relied upon for coordination went unanswered. Small contacts that had been helpful before were suddenly unavailable. The web she had counted on for support was unraveling. I realized in that moment that her carefully calculated moves, once so precise and deliberate, had now left her exposed. The quiet truth settled over the room, like a slow dawn. I didn't need to shout, to demand, to dramatize. The betrayal was fully visible, and the consequences were clear. She had played a long, calculated game, but she had underestimated my attention, my patience, and my ability to recognize patterns. The intelligence she had relied on as a weapon had become her vulnerability. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The control she had wielded so subtly, so deliberately, was gone. I didn't gloat, didn't rub it in. There was no satisfaction in cruelty. Instead, there was a quiet, careful sense of balance restored. The truth had emerged, fully and undeniably, and the last ally she had depended on had vanished, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices. Sitting there afterward, I felt a strange mixture of relief and solemnity. The confrontation hadn't been explosive, but it had been decisive. I had proven, with careful observation and strategic patience, that intelligence and forethought could counter manipulation and betrayal. And in that quiet resolution, I realized something profound. Revenge didn't need to be loud or violent to be complete. Sometimes the quiet unveiling of truth, meticulously documented and calmly presented, is the most powerful form of justice imaginable. After the truth had been revealed, the atmosphere between us shifted in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't dramatic or confrontational, but the energy was undeniably different. Emily moved with a new caution. Each gesture weighed against what she now knew I had discovered. There was no outward apology, no confession, just the subtle withdrawal of the last traces of control she had tried to maintain. Her confidence was gone, replaced by a careful, almost tentative approach to everything. I didn't rush to gloat or assert dominance. Instead, I let her face the consequences quietly. There was a strange power in restraint, in observing without interference. She had lost the advantage she had so meticulously built over weeks, and every small misstep she made now reflected the shift in balance. I watched her interact with documents, with the attorney, even with herself, and I could see her recalibrating constantly, trying to navigate a world where her previous leverage no longer existed. The estate process moved forward, but I approached it differently. I reviewed every document, every transaction, every procedural detail with exacting care. Each signature I made, each form I completed, was deliberate, precise, and informed by the lessons of the past weeks. I had learned to anticipate her strategies, to recognize subtle manipulations before they could take hold, and to act decisively without letting emotions cloud judgment. The quiet revenge I enacted wasn't violent, it wasn't theatrical, but it was intelligent, strategic, and utterly effective. Emily attempted a few small maneuvers at first, testing boundaries with cautious questions and minor document inquiries. I allowed her enough room to act, observing and documenting every move. But her efforts were weak in comparison to the strategy she had relied upon previously. The timing, the confidence, the subtle manipulation, all gone. Each action she attempted now only reinforced the control I had regained. It was almost ironic, the precision she had once used as a weapon now serving as evidence of her own overreach. I began taking measures to secure the remaining assets more tightly. Access was limited, confirmations documented, interactions carefully logged. It wasn't punitive. It was methodical, preventative. Every precaution was grounded in intelligence and foresight, not in anger. I wanted to ensure that no further surprises could compromise the estate or our remaining family relationships. In doing so, I also reclaimed a sense of calm and authority I hadn't felt since the first hints of her manipulation. There were moments of quiet reflection during those days, long stretches of time where I sat alone reviewing ledgers, emails, and files. The sun would filter through the blinds, casting long stripes of light across the desk, and the room felt heavy with the stillness of accountability. I thought about the weeks leading up to this moment, the subtle betrayals, the careful planning, the almost invisible ways she had tried to manipulate events. Each memory reinforced the importance of patience, observation, and calculated action. By midweek, the final signatures had been collected, the documents secured, and the estate properly balanced. The $3 million transfer she had attempted was corrected through legal channels, the irregularities noted, and her manipulations neutralized. She had no one left to rely on, no hidden ally to cover for her. The quiet justice I had enacted was complete, a careful restoration of order and fairness, without any need for confrontation or theatrics. The most remarkable part of the aftermath was the way Emily reacted, or rather, didn't react. She didn't lash out. She didn't fight. Instead, she adjusted, quietly accepting the consequences of her own actions. Her presence became subdued, the energy that once radiated subtle manipulation replaced with cautious observation. The balance had shifted entirely. She had lost her leverage, and the remaining dynamic between us was grounded in respect for the boundaries I had firmly established. I spent the evenings reflecting on what had occurred, realizing that the intelligence, patience, and careful observation I had applied were as much a form of personal growth as they were a strategy for justice. The quiet revenge I executed taught me more about human behavior, family dynamics, and the importance of vigilance than any confrontation ever could. The experience left me wary but wiser, measured but confident. By the end of the week, a new rhythm settled over the estate and our relationship. Emily remained present, but the tension was replaced by an uneasy calm. We interacted with mutual awareness of boundaries and consequences. No longer caught in the subtle games she had once orchestrated, I had reclaimed control, restored fairness, and ensured that the balance of trust, once broken, was now carefully monitored, intelligent, and sustainable. In the silence that followed, I realized that revenge didn't need to be loud or destructive to be effective. Quiet observation, strategic patience, and deliberate action could achieve more than confrontation ever could. And in that realization, I found a sense of satisfaction that was not about victory over someone else, but about reclaiming clarity, control, and the integrity of my own decisions. The aftermath of everything left me in a strange, quiet space of reflection. The estate was settled, the documents finalized, and the $3 million securely in place. Emily's attempts at manipulation had been neutralized, her last ally gone, and the balance restored. Yet, the emotional weight of the weeks I had endured didn't lift immediately. There was a lingering ache, a combination of betrayal, disbelief, and relief that settled deep in my chest, reminding me that even victory could carry its own cost. I spent hours walking through the house, noticing how the small details felt different now. The furniture, once familiar and comforting, seemed to echo the memory of subtle tension. The way light filtered through the windows, the faint hum of the air conditioning, even the smell of old wood and paper, it all seemed to reflect a life that had shifted irrevocably. The home was still the same, yet I was no longer the same person who had walked through its doors weeks before, naive and trusting. Sitting at the kitchen table one evening, I thought about my sister, not with anger, not with hatred, but with a careful understanding. Emily had made choices that led her to isolation, that severed the alliances she had counted on. Her intelligence and cunning had been undeniable, but in the end, her reliance on manipulation and secrecy had been her undoing. I felt a strange sense of clarity in recognizing the balance of human behavior. Trust and betrayal are powerful forces, and choices determine which side of the scale one ultimately occupies. The experience also left me thinking about my own responses. Patience, observation, and careful action had been my tools, and through them, I had reclaimed both control and integrity. I realized that revenge, when intelligent and measured, doesn't need to escalate to violence or drama. Justice can be achieved quietly, deliberately, and effectively. There's a power in restraint, a satisfaction in achieving fairness through thoughtfulness rather than impulse. It was a lesson I would carry with me far beyond the estate, beyond family conflicts, into every decision I made. Over the following weeks, life began to return to a steady rhythm. I engaged more carefully with my responsibilities, aware now of the subtle ways people can influence and manipulate. I noticed patterns in behavior, both in others and in myself, and learned to act with foresight and precision. The financial and emotional turbulence had left its mark, but it had also strengthened my ability to navigate complex dynamics without losing clarity or composure. I also reflected on Emily's place in all of this. She had been my closest family, someone I trusted implicitly, yet she had chosen a path that ended in isolation and exposure. There was no reconciliation in the immediate aftermath, but I understood the trajectory of her choices. I didn't wish her harm. Rather, I accepted that some lessons must be learned through consequence. And in accepting that, I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than victory or satisfaction. It was the calm of someone who had endured, observed, and acted with integrity. The quiet of the house at night became a time for reflection. I often sat in the study, the room still carrying the faint smell of paper and polished wood, and considered how subtle human actions can ripple outward in profound ways. The weeks of betrayal, observation, and careful strategy had left me with insights about trust, family, and the power of patience. Every subtle gesture, every small act of deceit, had been a lesson in perception and discernment, and I felt grateful for the clarity that had emerged from chaos. In many ways, the settlement of the estate marked more than the conclusion of legal matters. It symbolized a restoration of balance, a reclamation of authority, and a personal evolution that was earned through experience. I understood now that control doesn't come from aggression or dominance, but from awareness, preparation, and the willingness to act when necessary. The $3 million was more than money. It represented vigilance, intelligence, and the ability to navigate betrayal without losing integrity. Looking back, I realized that the ordeal had strengthened my understanding of human relationships. Trust is fragile, and those we consider closest can sometimes become the most unpredictable. But patience, careful observation, and deliberate action provide a form of security that no amount of loyalty or familiarity alone can guarantee. I had learned that justice is most effective when it is measured, deliberate, and undeniable, when it unfolds naturally from the truth, rather than through force or confrontation. As I closed the final folder and took one last look around the study, a calm settled over me. The estate was secure, Emily had no allies left to manipulate, and the quiet justice I had orchestrated was complete. More than anything, I felt a sense of personal growth, of lessons hard-earned and wisdom gained. Life would move forward, with vigilance and clarity now guiding every step, and I understood fully that sometimes the most powerful victories are those achieved quietly, deliberately, and with intelligence. In that quiet reflection, I felt the weight of the past weeks lift slightly, replaced with a renewed sense of purpose and understanding. Betrayal had tested me, patience had guided me, and justice had been delivered in its own quiet, meticulous way. And in that stillness, I finally allowed myself to breathe fully, knowing that the lessons I had learned would shape every choice I made moving forward.